The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the High Court building. Inside, the grand courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people filled every available seat. Today was no ordinary hearing. The case that had captured the nation's attention was about to unfold, and at the center of it all sat a 12-year-old boy named Marcus Chen. Marcus fidgeted with the sleeves of his borrowed suit jacket, which hung loosely on his small frame. His mother, Sarah Chen, reached over and gently squeezed his hand. She had been fighting this legal battle for 3 years, ever since the incident that changed their lives forever. What started as a simple complaint about police misconduct had grown into something much larger, something that would challenge the very foundations of how justice worked in their country. The courtroom was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. High ceilings stretched above them, decorated with intricate carvings and golden details. Behind the judge's bench hung a massive painting of Lady Justice, her blindfolded eyes seeming to look down on everyone present. Rows of wooden benches filled with reporters, lawyers, government officials, and curious citizens who had managed to secure a seat for what many were calling the trial of the decade. At the defendant's table sat Captain Williams and 3 other members of the Royal Guard, the elite police unit responsible for protecting government buildings and high-ranking officials. They wore their dress uniforms, medals gleaming under the courtroom lights. Captain Williams, a man in his 50s with graying hair and stern features, occasionally glanced toward Marcus with an expression that seemed to mix curiosity and concern. The case had begun 3 years earlier on what should have been a peaceful Saturday afternoon. Marcus and his mother had been visiting the National Museum, a grand building protected by the Royal Guard. What happened during that visit had set in motion a series of events that no one could have predicted. The official report stated that there had been a misunderstanding, a simple case of mistaken identity that was quickly resolved. But Sarah Chen knew there was more to the story, and she was determined to uncover the truth. As the lawyers shuffled their papers and whispered among themselves, Marcus remembered that day clearly. He had been excited to see the dinosaur exhibit, practically bouncing with energy as they walked through the museum's marble halls. His mother had been distracted, answering work emails on her phone when Marcus wandered into a restricted area. That's when he first encountered the Royal Guard. The lead prosecutor, Ms. Rodriguez, was a woman known for taking on difficult cases. She had built her career fighting for ordinary people against powerful institutions. When Sarah Chen first approached her office with this case, most lawyers had turned them away. Who would believe that the Royal Guard, respected and trusted by the public, could have acted improperly toward a child? But Ms. Rodriguez saw something in the evidence that others had missed. On the other side of the courtroom sat the defense team, led by Mr. Harrison, one of the country's most expensive lawyers. The government had spared no expense in defending the Royal Guard. Mr. Harrison was known for his ability to make even the most serious charges disappear. He had never lost a case involving government officials, and he didn't intend to start now. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom and everyone rose. She was a woman in her 60s, known for her fairness and no-nonsense approach to justice. She had presided over many high-profile cases, but this one was different. The presence of a child as the key witness, combined with the involvement of the Royal Guard, made this case particularly sensitive. The whole country would be watching her every decision. As everyone took their seats, Marcus noticed the press section was packed. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but dozens of reporters scribbled notes and sketched pictures. The story had been covered extensively in newspapers and on television, with opinions divided about what really happened that day at the museum. Some people believed the Chen family was seeking attention or money. Others suspected there was more to the story than the official reports revealed. The Royal Guard had been formed 50 years earlier as an elite unit within the police force. They were specially trained and held to higher standards than regular officers. They protected important buildings, escorted government officials, and maintained security at major events. In their distinctive blue uniforms with gold trim, they were a symbol of order and protection. The idea that they might have acted inappropriately was shocking to many people. Marcus's father had wanted to drop the case. He worried about the attention it would bring to their family and the potential consequences of challenging such a powerful institution. But Sarah was determined to see it through. She believed that what happened to Marcus could happen to any child, and she wanted to make sure it never happened again. The decision had caused tension in their marriage. and Marcus often heard his parents arguing late at night about whether they were doing the right thing. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Thompson began to speak. She explained the charges against the 4 members of the Royal Guard and outlined the procedures that would be followed during the trial. The main charge was misconduct in public office, but there were additional charges related to the treatment of a minor and filing false reports. If convicted, the officers could face significant prison time and would certainly lose their jobs. Ms. Rodriguez stood to give her opening statement. She spoke clearly and confidently, explaining that the evidence would show how the Royal Guard had abused their power and then tried to cover up their actions. She promised that by the end of the trial, the jury would understand exactly what happened that day at the museum and why justice demanded that these officers be held accountable for their actions. When Mr. Harrison rose to respond, he painted a very different picture. He described the Royal Guard officers as dedicated public servants who had been doing their job protecting an important national institution. He suggested that what happened was simply a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by people seeking to profit from false accusations against honorable men. As the opening statements concluded, Marcus felt his heart racing. Soon he would have to take the witness stand and tell his story in front of all these people. He looked around the courtroom one more time, taking in the faces of everyone who had come to hear what he had to say. Little did anyone know that his testimony would contain a revelation that would shock everyone present and change the course of the entire case. 3 years earlier, on that fateful Saturday afternoon at the National Museum, Marcus had been a typical 9-year-old boy filled with wonder and curiosity. The museum visit was supposed to be a special treat, a reward for his excellent grades in school. Sarah had promised him they would spend the entire afternoon exploring every exhibit, from ancient artifacts to the famous dinosaur collection that had made the museum internationally renowned. The National Museum was housed in a magnificent building that had once served as the Royal Palace. Its grand halls and ornate decorations made it feel like stepping back in time. Marble statues lined the corridors, and massive chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. The building itself was as much of an attraction as the exhibits it contained. The Royal Guard was responsible for its security, an assignment considered both prestigious and important, given the priceless artifacts housed within. Marcus remembered being particularly excited about seeing the new interactive dinosaur exhibit. He had read about it in National Geographic Kids and had been talking about it for weeks. As they entered the museum, Sarah had to stop at the information desk to pick up some materials for a work project. She was a freelance journalist working on an article about the museum's educational programs, which is why they had special access that day. While his mother spoke with the museum staff, Marcus wandered toward a corridor he hadn't noticed before. The hallway was dimmer than the main exhibition areas, lined with portraits of former museum directors and benefactors. A small brass sign indicated it led to administrative offices and research facilities. To a curious 9-year-old, it looked like an adventure waiting to happen. As Marcus walked down the hallway, he came upon a room with its door slightly open. Inside, he could see displays of artifacts that weren't part of the regular exhibition. These items seemed older and more mysterious than anything in the public galleries. Without thinking about whether he was allowed to be there, Marcus pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was filled with glass cases containing pottery, jewelry, and sculptures from various ancient civilizations. A small placard near the entrance indicated this was the museum's conservation laboratory, where experts worked to preserve and study artifacts before they were put on display. Marcus was fascinated by a particular golden mask that seemed to shine even in the dim lighting of the room. It was then that Captain Williams and Officer Stevens entered the room. They had been making their routine security rounds when they noticed the door to the conservation lab was open. This was highly irregular, as the room was supposed to be locked at all times when not in use by authorized personnel. When they saw Marcus standing near one of the display cases, their first assumption was that they had caught someone attempting to steal valuable artifacts. Captain Williams approached Marcus with his hand resting on his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. His voice was stern and commanding as he demanded to know what Marcus was doing in the restricted area. Officer Stevens moved to block the doorway, preventing any possible escape. To them, Marcus looked suspicious despite his young age. There had been cases in other museums where criminals used children to steal small valuable items because people were less likely to suspect a child of wrongdoing. Marcus was terrified. He had never been in trouble with police before, and the sight of these imposing officers in their formal uniforms made him freeze with fear. When Captain Williams grabbed his arm and began questioning him aggressively, Marcus started to cry. He tried to explain that he was just looking around while waiting for his mother, but his words came out jumbled and unclear through his tears. What happened next was the subject of dispute, but according to Marcus's account, Captain Williams became increasingly angry when he couldn't get clear answers from the frightened child. Officer Stevens suggested they should find the boy's parents, but Captain Williams insisted they needed to search Marcus first to make sure he hadn't taken anything. This search, conducted without the presence of a parent or guardian, was both unnecessary and improper given Marcus's age. During the search, Captain Williams found nothing suspicious, but his treatment of Marcus became rougher. He accused the boy of lying about how he had gotten into the room and suggested that Marcus was part of some larger scheme to steal from the museum. The officer's voice grew louder and more intimidating, causing Marcus to become even more upset and confused. Meanwhile, Sarah had finished her conversation at the information desk and was looking for her son. When she couldn't find him in the main exhibition area, she began to worry. Museum staff helped her search, and it was a security guard who suggested checking the administrative wing where some visitors, occasionally wandered by mistake. Sarah arrived at the conservation lab just as the situation between Marcus and the Royal Guard officers was escalating. She could hear her son crying from down the hallway and rushed toward the sound. When she entered the room, she found Marcus cornered by two large officers, his face red from crying and his clothing disheveled from the search they had conducted. The sight of her son in distress triggered Sarah's protective instincts. She demanded to know what was happening and why her child was being treated this way. Captain Williams explained that Marcus had been found in a restricted area and that they were investigating a possible theft attempt. Sarah was shocked by the suggestion that her 9-year-old son could be suspected of such a serious crime. Officer Stevens, who had been quietly observing the situation, seemed uncomfortable with how events were unfolding. He suggested to Captain Williams that they should document what had happened and let the family go, since no crime had actually been committed. But Captain Williams was not ready to back down. He seemed to view Sarah's arrival and her protective attitude toward Marcus as a challenge to his authority. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, with Captain Williams insisting that proper procedures needed to be followed, and Sarah demanding that her son be released immediately. Marcus remained silent during this exchange, still frightened and confused by what was happening to him. Other museum staff began to gather in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Eventually, Captain Williams agreed to let Marcus and Sarah leave, but not before making it clear that a report would be filed about the incident. He warned Sarah that attempting to access restricted areas was a serious matter, and that there could be consequences. Sarah was too focused on comforting her son to fully process the implications of this warning. As they left the museum that day, Sarah thought the incident was over. Marcus seemed to recover his spirits during the drive home, and they decided not to mention the encounter to his father right away. It wasn't until several weeks later, when Sarah received a formal notice about a police investigation, that she realized the Royal Guard officers had filed charges against her son for attempted theft and trespassing. The weeks following the museum incident passed quietly, and Sarah began to believe that the unpleasant encounter was behind them. Marcus had nightmares for a few days, but children are resilient, and he seemed to bounce back to his normal, cheerful self. He continued to do well in school and even expressed interest in visiting other museums, though Sarah noticed he always asked if they would be safe before agreeing to go. The first sign that their troubles were far from over came in the form of an official letter delivered by registered mail. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the legal document informing her that charges had been filed against her son. The formal language was difficult to understand, but the meaning was clear. Marcus was being accused of attempted theft and criminal trespass. The letter instructed them to appear at juvenile court within 30 days. Sarah called her husband David at work, her voice shaking as she read him the contents of the letter. David, who worked as an accountant at a small firm, was completely bewildered. How could a 9-year-old boy be charged with serious crimes for what seemed like innocent childhood curiosity? They both agreed they needed legal help immediately. But their savings were limited, and they had no idea how to find a lawyer who specialized in juvenile cases. That evening, Sarah and David sat Marcus down for a difficult conversation. They explained that the police officers from the museum had decided to make their case official, and that Marcus might have to go to court to tell his side of the story. Marcus was confused and frightened. He didn't understand why the officers thought he was trying to steal something, when he was just looking at the pretty things in the glass cases. The family's first meeting with a public defender was discouraging. The young lawyer, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed with cases, suggested they accept a plea bargain that would put Marcus on probation and require community service. He explained that fighting the charges would be expensive and risky, and that the Royal Guard officers were respected members of law enforcement whose word would carry significant weight in court. Sarah was horrified by the suggestion that her son should admit to crimes he didn't commit. She spent hours researching online, reading about similar cases and trying to understand their legal options. It was during this research that she discovered Ms. Rodriguez, a prosecutor turned defense attorney known for taking on cases involving police misconduct. Sarah sent a detailed email describing their situation, not really expecting a response from such a prominent lawyer. To her surprise, Ms. Rodriguez called the next day. She had read about similar incidents involving the Royal Guard and was interested in learning more about Marcus's case. During their initial consultation, she asked detailed questions about the incident and took careful notes about every aspect of Marcus's encounter with the officers. Something about the case troubled her, and she agreed to represent the family on a contingency basis. Ms. Rodriguez's investigation began immediately. She visited the museum and examined the conservation laboratory where Marcus had been found. She interviewed museum staff who had witnessed parts of the incident and reviewed security camera footage from the corridors leading to the restricted area. What she discovered troubled her greatly. The security cameras showed Marcus wandering innocently down the hallway, clearly lost rather than attempting to break into anywhere. The footage also revealed that the door to the conservation lab had been left unlocked by a museum employee who was taking a break, contradicting the Royal Guard's claim that Marcus had somehow forced his way into a secured area. Most importantly, the cameras captured the officer's treatment of Marcus during the confrontation, showing behavior that seemed excessive for dealing with a young child. As Ms. Rodriguez dug deeper, she uncovered a pattern of similar incidents involving the Royal Guard. There were reports of excessive force, improper searches, and intimidation tactics used against civilians, particularly those who couldn't fight back effectively. Many of these incidents had been covered up or dismissed by internal investigations that always concluded the officers had acted appropriately. The discovery that disturbed Ms. Rodriguez most was evidence that Captain Williams had a history of aggressive behavior that had been overlooked by his supervisors. There were multiple complaints from citizens about his conduct, including several involving children. These complaints had never resulted in serious disciplinary action, and Captain Williams had actually been promoted twice since the pattern of behavior began. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard was mounting its own investigation and building its defense. Internal documents later revealed that Captain Williams had been instructed to portray the incident as a serious security breach that required decisive action. The official report filed by the officers described Marcus as acting suspiciously and attempting to conceal items on his person, descriptions that bore no resemblance to what actually happened. The case began to attract media attention when Ms. Rodriguez filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Marcus. The motion included security camera footage and witness statements that contradicted the Royal Guard's version of events. Local news stations picked up the story, and public opinion began to divide. Some people were outraged that a child was being prosecuted for what appeared to be innocent behavior. Others supported the Royal Guard and suggested that the family was seeking attention or trying to profit from false accusations. As the preliminary hearings began, the stakes became clear. This wasn't just about Marcus's case anymore. Ms. Rodriguez's investigation had uncovered evidence of a broader pattern of misconduct within the Royal Guard, and prosecuting authorities were under pressure to either address these issues or defend an institution that had long been considered above reproach. The Royal Guard's union hired Mr. Harrison, one of the country's most expensive defense attorneys, to represent the officers. His strategy was to portray Marcus and his family as opportunists who were exploiting a minor misunderstanding for personal gain. He argued that the officers had been doing their job protecting valuable national treasures and that their actions were completely justified given the circumstances. Throughout this period, Marcus continued to attend school and try to maintain a normal childhood, but the stress of the legal proceedings was taking its toll. He became withdrawn and anxious, often asking his parents when the police trouble would be over. Sarah and David struggled to shield him from the media attention, while also preparing him for the possibility that he would need to testify in court. The case took an unexpected turn when Ms. Rodriguez received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have information about other incidents involving Captain Williams and the Royal Guard. The caller wouldn't identify themselves, but agreed to meet in a public place to share documents that they claimed would change everything about the case. The meeting took place in a busy coffee shop downtown, where Ms. Rodriguez met with a nervous middle-aged woman who identified herself only as a former museum employee. The documents she provided included incident reports, witness statements, and internal memos that had never been made public. According to these documents, the Royal Guard had been involved in multiple questionable incidents that had been covered up or minimized by museum administration and police supervisors. The anonymous documents provided by the former museum employee painted a disturbing picture of systemic problems within both the Royal Guard and the museum's administration. Ms. Rodriguez spent weeks verifying the authenticity of these papers, cross-referencing dates, names, and incident details with other sources. What emerged was evidence of at least 12 separate incidents over the past 5 years, where Royal Guard officers had used excessive force or engaged in inappropriate conduct, all of which had been covered up through a combination of false reports, intimidated witnesses, and administrative pressure. One document that particularly caught Ms. Rodriguez's attention was an internal memo from the museum director to the head of the Royal Guard, expressing concern about Captain Williams's increasingly aggressive approach to security matters. The memo, dated just 2 months before Marcus's incident, specifically mentioned complaints from visitors about Williams's treatment of children and suggested that he might benefit from additional training in de-escalation techniques. The response memo from the Royal Guard commander dismissed these concerns and actually praised Williams for his dedication to maintaining security standards. This exchange revealed a troubling disconnect between the museum's growing concerns and the Royal Guard's unwillingness to address problematic behavior within their ranks. As Ms. Rodriguez prepared for trial, she faced significant obstacles. Several potential witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearing retaliation from the Royal Guard or loss of employment. The museum administration, initially cooperative, became increasingly unresponsive as pressure mounted from government officials who didn't want this case to damage the reputation of an elite law enforcement unit. The anonymous source continued to provide information through carefully arranged meetings, always insisting on absolute secrecy. This person, who Ms. Rodriguez believed was a former museum security guard, revealed that there was a culture of fear among museum staff regarding the Royal Guard. Employees were discouraged from reporting incidents or filing complaints, and those who did often found themselves transferred to less desirable positions or subjected to increased scrutiny from supervisors. Meanwhile, the defense team led by Mr. Harrison was conducting its own investigation, but with very different goals. They were working to discredit Ms. Rodriguez's evidence and build a narrative that would portray the Royal Guard officers as victims of a coordinated attack on law enforcement. Harrison's team hired private investigators to look into the backgrounds of potential witnesses, searching for any information that could be used to undermine their credibility. The pressure on the Chen family continued to mount as the trial date approached. David received visits at work from unknown individuals asking questions about the family's finances and motivations for pursuing the case. Sarah discovered that her car had been vandalized, and their home address was posted on social media sites frequented by law enforcement supporters. The family was forced to temporarily move in with relatives for their safety. Marcus, now 12 years old and better able to understand the implications of the case, was struggling with the knowledge that his testimony could send respected police officers to prison. His parents and Ms. Rodriguez had explained that telling the truth was the most important thing, but the weight of this responsibility was overwhelming for someone his age. He began having difficulty sleeping and his grades at school started to decline. The prosecution faced another challenge when they learned that the security camera footage from the museum had been mysteriously corrupted. The museum's technical staff claimed there had been a system malfunction that affected recordings from the day of Marcus's incident. However, Ms. Rodriguez suspected this was no accident, especially since footage from other days remained intact and accessible. Dr. Patricia Yancey, a child psychologist specializing in trauma cases, was brought in to evaluate Marcus and help prepare him for his testimony. During their sessions, Marcus revealed details about the incident that he had never shared with his parents or anyone else. These revelations would later prove crucial to understanding what really happened that day at the museum. According to Dr. Yancey's notes, Marcus described feeling confused and scared when the officers first approached him. He said Captain Williams seemed angry from the moment he entered the room, even before asking any questions. Marcus also recalled hearing one of the officers say something about teaching him a lesson about respecting authority. Though this detail hadn't appeared in any of the official reports, perhaps most significantly, Marcus remembered hearing Captain Williams make a phone call during the incident, apparently to someone in authority at the museum. During this call, Williams reportedly said that they had caught a potential thief and needed to make an example of the situation to deter future problems. This suggested that the decision to pursue charges against Marcus wasn't made in response to his behavior, but rather as part of a deliberate strategy to send a message to other museum visitors. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in November, exactly 3 years after the original incident. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case through media coverage. Outside the building, supporters of both sides held signs and chanted slogans, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that belied the serious nature of the proceedings inside. Judge Thompson had to call for order several times during the opening statements as tensions in the courtroom ran high. The case had become symbolic of larger issues about police accountability and the treatment of children by law enforcement. Both sides knew that the outcome would have implications far beyond Marcus's individual situation. Ms. Rodriguez's opening statement was measured but powerful. She methodically laid out the evidence showing that Marcus had done nothing wrong and that the Royal Guard officers had violated their own procedures in their treatment of him. She promised the jury that by the end of the trial, they would see clear evidence that this case was about abuse of power rather than law enforcement. Mr. Harrison's response was equally compelling, but took a completely different approach. He portrayed his clients as dedicated public servants who were being unfairly persecuted for doing their job. He suggested that Ms. Rodriguez was using a child as a weapon to attack law enforcement and warned the jury not to be manipulated by emotional appeals that ignored the facts of the case. The first witnesses called were museum staff members who had been present on the day of the incident. Their testimony was carefully controlled, with both sides objecting frequently to questions they felt went beyond the scope of direct knowledge. Most of these witnesses admitted they hadn't seen the actual confrontation between Marcus and the officers, but several confirmed that the conservation lab door was often left unlocked during busy periods. The testimony that created the biggest stir came from Dr. Mitchell Stevens, the museum's head of security, who had not been called by either side but was subpoenaed by the court. Under oath, Stevens revealed that he had recommended Captain Williams be removed from museum duty after several concerning incidents, but that his recommendation had been overruled by higher authorities, who felt that making changes would imply the Royal Guard had done something wrong. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this case was about much more than what happened to one 12-year-old boy in a museum. The evidence being presented was exposing deep-rooted problems in how elite law enforcement units operated, and the lengths to which institutions would go to protect their reputations, even at the expense of justice for individual citizens. The moment everyone had been waiting for arrived on the fourth day of the trial, when Marcus Chen was called to the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as the now 12-year-old boy walked slowly from the gallery to the front of the room. He wore a dark blue suit that his mother had bought specially for the occasion, and his hands shook slightly as he placed his right hand on the Bible to be sworn in. Judge Thompson spoke to Marcus in a gentle voice, explaining that he should answer questions honestly and let her know if he didn't understand something or needed a break. She had handled many cases involving child witnesses and knew how intimidating the formal courtroom setting could be for someone Marcus's age. The jury watched with obvious sympathy as this young person prepared to testify about an experience that had changed his family's life forever. Ms. Rodriguez approached Marcus with a warm smile, hoping to put him at ease before beginning her questioning. She started with basic information about his age, school, and interests, allowing him to get comfortable speaking in the courtroom environment. Marcus's voice was quiet at first, but he gradually became more confident as he talked about familiar topics like his favorite subjects in school and his hobby of collecting dinosaur books. When Ms. Rodriguez began asking about the day at the museum, Marcus's demeanor changed noticeably. His voice became smaller and he fidgeted with his hands as he recalled the excitement he had felt about seeing the dinosaur exhibit. He explained how his mother had stopped to talk with museum staff and how he had wandered off to explore while waiting for her to finish her conversation. Marcus described discovering the hallway with the portraits and finding the door to the conservation laboratory slightly open. His curiosity as a 9-year-old had gotten the better of him, and he had pushed the door open to see what was inside. He spoke about being amazed by the golden mask and other artifacts, comparing them to treasures he had seen in adventure movies and books. The courtroom remained completely quiet as Marcus recounted the moment when Captain Williams and Officer Stevens entered the room. He described feeling scared when the officers started asking him questions in loud, angry voices. His account of being searched and questioned differed significantly from what the officers had reported, painting a picture of 2 adults intimidating a frightened child rather than conducting a professional security investigation. When Ms. Rodriguez asked Marcus about the most upsetting part of the experience, his answer surprised everyone in the courtroom. He said the worst part wasn't being scared or even being searched, but rather hearing Captain Williams say that he needed to be taught a lesson so other children would know not to cause trouble at the museum. This statement, which hadn't appeared in any of the official reports, suggested that the officers' actions were punitive rather than investigative. Mr. Harrison's cross-examination was careful and respectful, as he knew the jury would not respond well to aggressive questioning of a child. He focused on trying to show that Marcus might be confused about some details or influenced by conversations with his parents and lawyers over the 3 years since the incident. He suggested that a 9-year-old might not accurately remember everything that happened or might misinterpret adult conversations he overheard. However, Marcus proved to be a more resilient witness than expected. When Mr. Harrison questioned whether he really remembered specific phrases the officers used, Marcus surprised everyone by providing additional details that made his account even more credible. He recalled that Captain Williams had been chewing gum and that Officer Stevens had a small scar on his left hand, details that could be verified and that suggested his memory of the incident was accurate. The most dramatic moment of Marcus's testimony came when Ms. Rodriguez asked him if there was anything else about the incident that he hadn't shared before. Marcus looked toward his parents in the gallery, then back at the lawyer, and said he had remembered something else while talking to Dr. Yancey, the child psychologist. According to Marcus, during the time when Captain Williams was making his phone call, he overheard the officer say something that had confused him at the time, but that he now understood was important. Williams had apparently told the person on the phone that this incident would be perfect for sending a message about museum security and that they should make sure it gets proper attention from the press. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. If Marcus was correct, it suggested that Captain Williams had seen the incident as an opportunity for publicity rather than a genuine security concern. It implied that the decision to pursue charges against Marcus had been made not because of his actions, but because his case could be used to demonstrate the Royal Guard's vigilance in protecting national treasures. Mr. Harrison immediately objected to this testimony, arguing that it was hearsay and that a 9-year-old couldn't be expected to accurately remember or interpret adult conversations. However, Judge Thompson allowed the testimony to stand, noting that Marcus was describing what he personally heard, rather than what someone else told him happened. The defense team was clearly rattled by this unexpected revelation. They had prepared their strategy based on the assumption that Marcus would simply recount the basic facts of the incident, not provide new information that could fundamentally change how the jury viewed the officer's motivations. During a recess, they could be seen in heated discussions about how to respond to this development. When the trial resumed, the prosecution called Captain Williams to the stand as a hostile witness. Under oath, Williams denied making any phone call during the incident with Marcus or expressing any desire to use the case for publicity purposes. However, his testimony was contradicted by phone records that Ms. Rodriguez had subpoenaed, showing a call from Williams's cell phone to the museum director's office at the exact time Marcus described. The museum director, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, was then called to testify about the content of that phone call. Under intense questioning, she admitted that Williams had indeed contacted her during the incident and had suggested that pursuing charges against Marcus would demonstrate the seriousness with which the Royal Guard took security threats. She claimed she had discouraged this approach, but Williams had proceeded anyway. Officer Stevens, the second Royal Guard member present during the incident, provided testimony that further undermined his partner's credibility. While he stopped short of directly contradicting Williams's account, Stevens admitted that he had been uncomfortable with how the situation was handled and had suggested they should simply escort Marcus back to his mother rather than conducting a search or filing charges. The revelation that the case against Marcus had been pursued primarily for publicity purposes rather than legitimate law enforcement reasons created a media sensation. Newspaper headlines proclaimed that a child had been used as a pawn in a public relations strategy, and calls for investigation into the Royal Guard's practices grew louder. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, it was clear that Marcus's unexpected testimony had fundamentally altered the case. What had begun as a dispute about whether proper procedures were followed in a security incident had become an examination of institutional abuse of power and the willingness of authorities to sacrifice individual justice for organizational interests. The prosecution now had evidence that the charges against Marcus were not just unjustified, but had been filed in bad faith as part of a calculated strategy to enhance the Royal Guard's public image. The defense, meanwhile, faced the challenge of explaining why their clients had pursued a case they knew was baseless, and why they had been less than truthful in their official reports and testimony. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the trial had begun. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been on opening day, as word of Marcus's shocking testimony had spread throughout the community and beyond. News crews lined the streets outside the courthouse, and the story had become national headline news. Ms. Rodriguez approached the jury with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing the facts are on your side. She began by reminding the jury of the simple truth at the heart of the case. A 9-year-old boy had wandered into a museum room through an unlocked door, looked at beautiful artifacts with the innocent curiosity of childhood, and had been turned into a criminal by adults who saw an opportunity to advance their own agenda. She methodically reviewed the evidence that had emerged during the trial. The security footage showing Marcus wandering innocently down the hallway. The testimony from museum staff confirming that the conservation lab door was frequently left unlocked. The phone records proving that Captain Williams had called the museum director during the incident, despite denying this under oath. Most damning of all, the revelation that Williams had seen Marcus's case as a perfect opportunity for positive publicity for the Royal Guard. This case was never about protecting museum artifacts, Ms. Rodriguez told the jury, her voice rising with controlled passion. This was about powerful people using their authority to intimidate a child and his family. This was about officers who were more interested in headlines than in justice. This was about a system that was willing to prosecute an innocent child to make themselves look good. She pointed out the inconsistencies in the officers' testimony and the way their stories had changed as evidence mounted against them. She reminded the jury that Officer Stevens had admitted being uncomfortable with how the situation was handled and that even the museum director had tried to discourage Williams from pursuing charges against Marcus. The most powerful moment of her closing argument came when she asked the jury to imagine their own children or grandchildren in Marcus's position. Picture a 9-year-old child excited about seeing dinosaurs wandering into a room full of beautiful things. Picture that child being grabbed, searched, and terrorized by adults in uniform. Picture that child then being dragged through 3 years of legal proceedings, not because he did anything wrong, but because those adults needed a villain for their story. Mr. Harrison's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal strategy. Even though he was defending an increasingly difficult position, he focused on the technical aspects of the law and the burden of proof required for criminal convictions. He argued that while mistakes might have been made, criminal intent had not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. He portrayed his clients as dedicated public servants who had made judgment calls in a difficult situation. He suggested that the phone call to the museum director was simply proper procedure for reporting a security incident, not evidence of a publicity scheme. He argued that the passage of 3 years had allowed emotions and media attention to distort what was really a minor misunderstanding. "My clients are not perfect," Harrison acknowledged. "They may have handled this situation differently with the benefit of hindsight. But being imperfect is not the same as being criminal. These officers believed they were doing their job, protecting valuable national treasures. They deserve the benefit of the doubt that we would want for ourselves in their position." However, Harrison's argument was undermined by the weight of evidence that had emerged during the trial. The jury had heard too much testimony and seen too many documents that contradicted the officers' version of events. Most importantly, they had heard Marcus's clear, consistent account of what happened, and his revelation about overhearing Williams's phone conversation had provided a motive that made sense of all the other evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Judge Thompson called the court to order as the jury foreman stood to announce their decision. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud as everyone waited to hear the outcome of this closely watched case. "On the charge of misconduct in public office," the foreman said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "we find the defendant Williams guilty." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery as he continued with guilty verdicts on all remaining charges against Williams, including filing false reports and improper treatment of a minor. Officer Stevens received a mixed verdict, found guilty of misconduct but acquitted of the more serious charges. The jury apparently accepted that he had been following his superior's lead and had shown some reluctance about the way the situation was handled. The other 2 officers were acquitted of all charges. As the evidence had shown, they arrived after the initial confrontation and had limited involvement in the decision-making. As the verdicts were read, Marcus sat between his parents in the gallery, looking both relieved and overwhelmed by the attention focused on him. Sarah Chen hugged her son tightly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that their 3-year ordeal was finally over. David put his arms around both of them, his own emotions barely under control. Captain Williams showed no visible reaction to the verdict, but his wife, who had attended every day of the trial, broke down in tears. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Thompson announced that sentencing would take place in 30 days, and that Williams would remain free on bail until that time. Outside the courthouse, Ms. Rodriguez held a press conference on the steps of the building. She was flanked by Marcus and his parents, though she made it clear that the family would not be taking questions from reporters. She spoke about the broader implications of the case and the need for accountability in law enforcement at all levels. "This case was never just about Marcus Chen," she told the assembled media. "This case was about whether powerful institutions can abuse their authority without consequences. Today's verdict sends a clear message that no one, regardless of their position or uniform, is above the law." The fallout from the trial continued for months. Captain Williams was sentenced to 18 months in prison and permanently barred from law enforcement work. Officer Stevens received probation and was transferred out of the Royal Guard. An investigation into the Royal Guard's practices led to significant reforms in training and oversight procedures. The museum implemented new security protocols that emphasized de-escalation and proper treatment of visitors, especially children. Dr. Harper, the museum director, resigned her position amid criticism of how the institution had handled the incident and subsequent cover-up attempts. For Marcus and his family, the end of the trial marked the beginning of healing from their traumatic experience. Marcus, now 13, returned to his normal routine of school and friends, though he carried with him the knowledge that he had played a crucial role in exposing institutional corruption and protecting other children from similar treatment. The case became a landmark in juvenile justice and police accountability, studied in law schools and referenced in legislative hearings about law enforcement reform. Marcus's courage in telling the truth, even when it was difficult and frightening, had changed not just his own life but had helped create a more just system for everyone. Years later, as Marcus grew into adulthood, he would often reflect on that day in the museum when his childhood curiosity had led to such unexpected consequences. The golden mask that had first captured his attention remained on display in the museum. But now it served as a reminder not just of ancient civilizations, but of the power of truth to overcome institutional deception and the importance of protecting the innocent from those who would abuse their authority.